Just an FYI, this weekend, Friday and Saturday, there's a conference here in Washington, D.C. It's called Lessons of Vietnam. Lessonsofvietnam.com is the website. And I will be moderating a special panel. It's titled The Personal Impact of Our Actions and Reflections on Same, with Alan Canfora, Mark Rudd, David Harris, and Susan Schnall this Saturday afternoon at 1:30 here in Washington, D.C. If you're in the area, you're going to be in the area, and you want to drop by. And it's going to be a fascinating gig. And another one of the folks who's going to be speaking there, I believe, is David Cortright. David is an American scholar and peace activist, director of policy studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and chair of the board of the Fourth Freedom Forum. And his website, David Cortright, CORTRIGHT.net. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tom. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
First of all, introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers. Your story. What brought you to this point?
Right. Well, I'm a professor of peace studies at Notre Dame, and I always tell the students I came to this position in an unusual way. I became interested in peace when I was drafted for the U.S. Army to fight in Vietnam in 1968. And I went into the Army, and once I was in and saw what was happening in Vietnam, I began to speak out against the war as an active duty GI. So I was part of the GI and veterans movement against the war. And, that set me on a path of being concerned about peace and trying to prevent war, and I've tried to stay on that path all my life.
And you're going to be participating in the closing plenary on Saturday afternoon, I understand, at
exactly.
Lessons of Vietnam.
We have this big conference, Vietnam, the Power of Protest, Telling the Truth and Learning the Lessons. And we're going to have more than 600 people have pre-registered, and we'll be at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in D.C. And our goal is to really recall and pay tribute to the role of the anti-war movement. And the fact is that the majority of Americans oppose that war. Millions of us organized against it. And ultimately, we helped to bring that war to an end. And that was an important role that citizen democracy tried to play in ending this unjust war in Vietnam.
We've seen a variety of movements from the bottom up throughout the history of our country. The abolition movement, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the peace movement that you were just so eloquently speaking of. Now, I believe what we're seeing in Baltimore right now, in Ferguson and all around the country, perhaps to some extent as a result of this disruptive technology of cell phone cameras being so cheap and so ubiquitous that even in poor neighborhoods, or especially in poor neighborhoods, they're widespread. And so now white middle-class people who had no idea what the average life of black people was, given the status of policing in many of our major cities, in fact, I'd say probably all of them, are realizing that there's something going on here. There are real complaints. What are your thoughts on movement politics in contemporary America as opposed to what you and I experienced as members of the anti-war movement back in the 60s?
Right. There's greater possibilities for movements now. The policies of injustice and repression and war are always built on deception and misinformation and propaganda. But now, when we have these communication tools in our hands, we're able to learn the truth. And when we are citizen witnesses, as the people in Baltimore were, they can take that picture, put it on the internet, and people can know the kinds of injustices that blacks and others are facing in Baltimore and so many other cities. So we've really got that tool of communications technology that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
The problem sometimes is, just to look at the other side of it, is sometimes people think, well, that's all you have to do. Just click, friend a particular site, pass it on to other friends. And that's important, but we also need to get out into the streets. Ultimately, all of these movements depend upon people mobilizing, making a sacrifice, giving money, getting out into the streets, facing the police if necessary, always remaining nonviolent. As Dr. King told us, our greatest power is in nonviolence. But we do need to sacrifice. We do need to demonstrate and put our lives on the line sometimes in order to bring about justice.
Well, in 68 and 69 back in East Lansing, this was one of the big debates we had. We're seeing right now in Baltimore, for example, 6 days of 10,000 people marching in the street peacefully, no press coverage. A few hours of a small number of people burning down a couple of buildings, it's wall to wall for days. And this was one of the schisms in SDS was the Weather Underground, the folks who were saying, we've got to take direct action. We've got, violence is the only way to wake up an essentially violent machine. I didn't go down that road. I stayed with SDS as opposed to the Weather Underground. I had friends who did, however. And what lessons can we learn from that now? And to what extent was there actually some truth to what those guys in the Weather Underground were saying?
Well, I believe firmly, as Dr. King taught, that we must remain committed to nonviolence. And I think if we look back on the Vietnam anti-war movement, we hurt ourselves in many respects by some of the things we did. We were too divisive and too sectarian within our own movement. But also those who resorted to violence and, street trashing and those kind of tactics actually enabled Nixon to evoke this theme of law and order and really fed some of the right-wing tendencies at the time. And if you look at the polls in that era, the majority of Americans increasingly came to oppose the war and saw it as a mistake. But the public view of the anti-war movement, in some respects, went down as more of these disruptive tactics and indeed even embrace of violence occurred. So, we get press coverage if you, trash the streets and break windows and throw rocks at the police.
Right.
But what is the content of that press? And we need to keep the focus on the issues of justice and repression and these Gestapo tactics that our police are using in American cities today and the incredible injustices and repression that people of color face. And that's the main issue. And there's a risk when we engage in violence, throw rocks at police, I think, that it distracts attention from our core issues of justice.
Yeah, I absolutely understand and agree. I mean, it's understandable, the frustration. This is essentially the debate that I was having on this program, 2 years ago, whenever Occupy was at its peak, and we had a couple of the Black Bloc guys come on and try to convince us that, hey, it's a good thing to go burn down a bank. And I'm like, no, that's what the man wants you to do. Mm-hmm. And they will use that against you, and they did. I mean, the Seattle protests that went bad, the WTO protests back a decade ago.
Right. And we can be disruptive with nonviolent methods. Dr. King taught us that.
Yes.
Protesting and demonstrating is fine, but sometimes you have to go to jail. Sometimes you have to put your body on the line and face that police repression. And that will draw attention, too, because it's a dramatic indication of the willingness of people to sacrifice and to pay a price to struggle for their freedom. And if we can do that, be disruptive, be assertive, try to, put a big monkey wrench in the operations of the repressive system, but doing that while remaining committed to nonviolence, that's difficult. But I think that's the sweet spot where we can make a real...
I agree. I think it takes a lot more courage to sit down in the middle of the street with a bunch of your friends and shut down a city. Exactly. And then get arrested and taken to jail for it. This is a passive resistance, as opposed to let's throw some stones and Molotov cocktails at a CVS. On the other hand, as I said,
passive. I remember, I teach Gandhi in my classes, and Gandhi always hated that word, passive resistance. He said, "We are active. We are assertive. We are fighting for justice.
I got it.
We're going to disrupt the system in an active and engaged way."
Brilliant, David Cortright, CORTRIGHT.net, the website. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Tom.